If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
Good morning and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer at the Washington Post. We have a great lineup for you today, featuring UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet from Chile, and former Liberian President, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. We had planned to have Secretary Clinton join us here today, but she was invited by the Ginsburg family to pay her respects to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She sent us a video to share with you about the topics at hand.
Hello, everyone. I had planned to join you live today, but I'm headed to the Supreme Court to pay tribute to someone who blazed a trail for me and countless other women, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know she would have loved today's conversation with two extraordinary leaders, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Michelle Bachelet. These two women deserve all of the accolades that have come their way for their leadership and courage. You know, 25 years ago this month, the world came together to say with one voice that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all. And in many ways, women are better off today than we were back then. We've nearly closed the gender gap in primary school enrollment, and maternal mortality has dropped by more than half, to name just two examples of the progress that has been made around the world. But we still have a long way to go. Expanding women's rights and opportunities and full participation in all aspects of their societies is the great unfinished business of the 21st century. And that great unfinished business has taken on new urgency in the middle of a global pandemic, an economic crisis, and a long overdue reckoning with racism. So this is a moment to redouble our commitment to not only changing laws and policies, but to transforming cultural norms and attitudes about women's roles, value, and power. The Beijing Plus 25 report from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security lays out a roadmap for global gender equality that I know will help us chart our path forward for the next 25 years and beyond. Justice Ginsburg once said, "Women belong in all the places where decisions are being made." Well, those words ring just as true today. So I hope this conversation will inform and inspire, and most of all, galvanize us to continue the important work ahead.
Good morning. Once again, I'm Frances Steed Sellers, and thank you so much for joining Washington Post Live's special program about accelerating progress for women and girls. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our first guest, Michelle Bachelet. She's the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Frances. Very happy to have this opportunity to talk on a very crucial and timely issue.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for coming. I'd like to start by asking you, from your vantage point as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, what is the status now for women and girls? And then more precisely, what are the urgent needs during the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, as Hillary has said, since Beijing, 25 years afterwards, of course, we have had progress, but those progress have been slow and uneven. It's true, more women, more girls at schools. It's true also maternal mortality has declined. It's true we have had an increased number of parliamentarian and ministers and women in political positions, but still we have 1 on 3 women that is experiencing violence in her lifetime, more than 800 women who die every day from preventable causes given birth, and of course on average men earn 63% more than women. So the current pandemic has also highlighted the particular impact that it has on women. I mean, the virus does not differentiate anyone, everybody can get it, but it impacts disproportionately certain groups, and in particular women. You can also think, if you can even make it more specific, older women, and of course women living with disabilities and girls. And we have seen that it has increased the discrimination and inequalities that women had from before the COVID-19. So what we can see is the concentration of women in the informal sector with insecure and low paid jobs. For example, the burden of the unpaid childcare, the pervasiveness of the gender-based violence that has increased dramatically during lockdowns and confinements in all parts of the world. The continued exclusion from women in decision-making. We will see in countries where they develop this committee to response of COVID-19, in very few there are women, the majority are only men. And also there is a resistance to women autonomies over their bodies and life. For example, many governments have declared that the sexual reproductive health and services, rights services are not essential. So they're not providing those services to women, or not providing shelters for women who are victims of violence. So we would say that also the pandemic has further reinforced gender inequality, because it has widened as well poverty and education gender gap. And we have seen more women losing their employment because of the kind of jobs they usually work on are very affected by the recession. But also, as I said before, because so many women work in the informal economy and they do not have access to social protection schemes, so they really are in a very dire situation. But also, gaps in education has affected, importantly, girls, and many girls don't have access to online education as well.
High Commissioner, you referenced the growing number of women in leadership positions, and it's been striking during the pandemic that countries led by women, from New Zealand to Germany and Finland, have been praised for their response. What makes women leaders particularly effective?
Well, you know, there's a discussion on this. Yes, I've heard that from the 12 most successful countries, 7 are led by women, or 8. I think it's a mix of situations. First of all, women, first of all, they have the same capacities of leading that men, in terms of they can make strong decisions, they can be very decisive, but they can be very transparent on one hand. They speak with the truth. They prefer not to deny the problems. They prefer to say, look, this is a problem. This is the way we're going to deal with it. They communicate it to the people, and they go to the people. They use their capacity to explain to the people why different measures are important. And we have different experiences, from Angela Merkel talking to the Germans that maybe 60% of the Germans are going to be infected, to the Norwegian or the Finnish prime minister saying, going to the children, explaining to the children which are the measures that need to be done. So I would say innovative way, transparency, decisive actions. So none of those stereotypes that say that women cannot be good leaders have been shown clearly on this COVID-19 response.
You are one of 25 leaders in a group that Secretary Clinton just referred to, providing a sort of update on the 25th anniversary of that famous Beijing Women's Conference. Can you tell us about your findings and recommendations?
Well, yes, I think we still need to go further in terms of which are the most pressing needs for advance. One is, as Hillary was mentioning, gender norms, because it remains hard to change the culture or the deep-rooted discriminatory social norms, beliefs, and stereotypes about women about women's roles, about women's characteristics. This underlies all discrimination. For example, in political participation, the false idea that women are weaker, that are not suited to rule, that they're too emotional, and they do not have attributes that are considered necessary for leadership, like strength and decisiveness. And I was just mentioning that we have complete different reality. I think backlash as well, because women's rights and human rights generally has been under attack for quite some time now. And and we have seen efforts to diminish funding for women's rights organizations, to remove comprehensive sex education, to change the definition of gender to a binary concept, to reduce access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services for women, to prohibit gender studies, and meant harmful gender stereotypes and social norms about the natural roles of women and men. Violence remains a very silent and pervasive crisis, and this includes physical, mental, sexual, financial violence, of course, femicide, harmful practices, and more. And the other thing is, as I said, SRHR, I mean, there's a failure to secure care on sexual and reproductive health and rights to protect bodily autonomy. And what would it mean? And it will mean also with the COVID-19 that we will have hundreds of thousands of women who will die each year of complications of pregnancy. Probably we will increase the number of child marriage. And of course, there's a lot of women who will be also victims of slavery, even for sexual, human trafficking and sexual slavery. There's an increase in child marriage and pregnancy. The other very important thing for me is economic inequality. We really need to deal with the issue that women, and even not only, even professional, what I have seen in some news is that women, because of they have 3 kids, they have to stop working the whole day. They're working part-time. That will mean less incomes and less possibilities probably. But the majority of women in the world and the majority of the people in the world work in the informal economy. They earn less, they save less, they hold less secure jobs, they have less access to social protection. So the capacity of absorbing economic shocks is much less than men. And according to WEF, the World Economic Forum, it will take 257 years before men and women receive equal pay for equal job. That's very bad. Of course, political participation, we already talked about that. And finally, peace and security. I would say there's still a global lack of progress in realizing women's rights to equally and meaningfully participating in conflict. When I was at UN Women, the executive director, and I asked, why don't we have more women peace mediators? They told me there's not enough peace mediators. And I said, that's not possible. Let's build a roster. I'm sure there's great women who can make a great difference. But now we still have only 13% of the negotiators are women. So I think there's many issues where we need to continue pushing forward so women can contribute with all its capacity, skills, and experiences.
So on this question of pushing forward or retreat or backsliding, I'd like to ask you a little about the sad issue that's taken Secretary Clinton from us today, and that's the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was such a trailblazer for women's rights. Many women in the United States are concerned this could be the beginning of backsliding or a continuation of backsliding for women's rights. Do you see that as a problem internationally and nationally?
I have seen it. I have seen this backslide, and I have the honor to meet Justice Ruth Ginsburg, and she was a fantastic woman. And when I was at UN Women, and I think, of course, it's important that we have women that do believe in women in important positions, because I have met women who think that they are good because they're good, and they believe that they don't understand the need to open more spaces for women in the decision making, in the boards of companies, in every place where you are taking good decisions. So there is a risk of backsliding. There is a risk, as I said as well, on backsliding in the progress of women participation in the labor market. And there is the excuse that could be used against women because of COVID-19 that could put women in a weaker position. But that's why we should not give up, and we should to continue advocacy and showing. And I always said, look, one of the conclusions we should take of COVID-19, which is, of course, the majority of the health workers were women, and we applauded them. And for many months, we applauded them every day, every night. but we have much more than that. We have women in essential services. We have women also leaders, and we need to recognize. And one of the things that we need to come after COVID-19 is to build back better. And build back better means...
I'd love to ask you now a question about the rise of authoritarianism, which I think is something we're seeing in many countries around the world. You were a prisoner. You were held as a political prisoner. I believe even had a hood put over your head. Do you see the rounding up of protesters in this country by unidentified government forces as a threat of fascism rising here?
Well, I think in every place where you can have the possibility of groups that are violent, that do not respect democracy, who are racist, who do not respect the freedom of the people, who do not respect diversity, there is risk of going into not a democratic way. I don't know if we could call it fascism, but clearly not the right direction.
So do you see a link between authoritarian regimes and the oppression of women?
There is indeed. There is. We see that directly. Usually authoritarian regimes do not respect women's rights, and women are discriminated in a very important way. That doesn't mean that in all democratic governments they do that different, but at least we have seen that relationship between authoritarian, many of them very nationalist, very, if I would say, endogamist regimes, and then they don't give the space to women, and they're losing the contribution of women.
And let me ask you a question that's coming from our audience. This is from Noelle Connolly from Washington State in the United States, who asks, I'm going to read it to you, are traditional values and women's equality inherently at odds? If not, how can we demonstrate that to communities that may perceive these values in conflict?
Well, I don't know what, I mean, I think that you can have traditional values that are positive, and you can have traditional values that are negative, because in the past, slavery was something that was a norm, but of course we have evolved as society. And on the other hand, I think the best way that society can perceive that women's equality and women's empowerment is essential is when you can show, not only speak about women's rights, but also speak about how to work with women in terms of giving them the space they deserve. It's also the smart thing to do. And to show the great examples that you can find fantastic women everywhere in the communities, in the working place, in the social sectors, in government and local governments, etc. And I think that's the best way to convince people that women's equality is essential and is crucial for a well-developed democracy.
I have one last question for you, High Commissioner, before I'm afraid we have to finish. You called earlier this year for reparations for the United States to make amends for slavery. Do you think the perception of the United States has changed around the world as a liberal democracy? How does the rest of the world see us?
Well, we have seen some studies and surveys that have shown that the perception on the US has changed from countries. Many countries who used to be were very fond of the US, now they have a different perception, not as good as before. And I think that that what people want from the US is a US who is more engaged with the world, who understands that nobody's going to solve their problems by themselves. That even the COVID-19 has shown us that no one is going to save themselves if not everyone is safe, and I think people are expecting that from the U.S. a commitment to everyone, to be a leader in terms of democratic values, in terms of anti-racism, in terms of ensuring freedom of freedom, not only in the speech, but in the reality, in terms of gender equality, of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services, etc., etc. I think that's what people in the world want to see again in the US.
UN High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Frances. All the best, and my best hugs to Ellen.
Yes, that leaves me in to say after a short break, I'll be back with former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And thank you again to Michelle Bachelet.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Here we are 25 years after Beijing, and we are still experiencing this tremendous inaccessibility for women to get what they really need in terms of this area.
Every person is equal, and every woman, every girl deserves her shot at life.
One of the things that the women leaders on gender and climate change needed to do was to make space for grassroots women, for Indigenous women, for young women.
Seeing successful female leaders makes it easier for the next female leader.
And it is a great opportunity.
Developing a vision, articulating it with passion and compassion. I think women leaders are way better in doing that.
Nothing to turn back. It's only about future. We cannot build anything on what we had. We need to create future. We live today and tomorrow.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Pat Mitchell, co-founder of the Connected Women Leaders Initiative, and it's such a great pleasure to be a part of a forum that is focusing on the qualities and attributes of women leaders and the differences they have made. And please join me now in welcoming a man who has made enormous differences for women and hundreds of millions of people around the world through his lifetime commitment as a global development leader, and now in his role as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Please welcome Dr. Raj Shah. Morning, Raj.
Good morning, Pat. Thank you for your leadership and your great work.
It's such a privilege to have this opportunity to speak with you about the Foundation's work across many areas, but I want to reference a forum that I had a privilege to attend, put together by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Brookings Institute just a few days ago, to support and strengthen the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Two phrases were heard all day during the forum. One of them is that gender equality is a necessary component of any recovery or solution plan. And the second was the call for a reset on how we see a just and equitable recovery. How do you see this? What does this look like from your perspective?
Well, Pat, your work in support of women's leadership at home and around the world has been so valuable for such a long period of time, and I want to thank you for the contributions you've made. When we look at the COVID-19 crisis as a team and as a community, we see a crisis that has had extraordinary impact already on the scale of the Great Depression or World War II. And frankly, we see a crisis that will last through 2021, 2022, and in much of the emerging world, for most of the world's population, through 2023. For every 6 months we're in crisis, we know that there are 31 million additional acts of gender-based violence in homes and communities around the world. We know that women have lost 54% of the jobs that have been lost through this crisis so far, despite accounting for 39% of total global labor force participation. And we know, as I saw President Gillard, or Prime Minister Gillard, former Prime Minister, make her comment, she reminded our group at Rockefeller that in fact, all of this exciting digital acceleration, the ability to do all of what we're doing right now remotely, is also likely to exacerbate gender inequities and push women into more and higher percentages of unpaid labor share of burden over the course of the next decade if we don't reset norms and standards, and if we don't invest in a just recovery in a manner that actually lifts up women and other groups that otherwise are not prioritized in the context of the investments that take place. So a just recovery is building back better. It is making sure that when countries receive and make large-scale fiscal investments to help their economies recover, whether it's a $2 trillion green infrastructure program in the United States or a multi-billion-dollar investment in East Africa, that those investments are governed by a focus on women, that we're collecting data on the impact on women's labor force participation. When there's an effort to create jobs, we're preferentially focusing on creating jobs for women. when there's an effort to reopen schools. We're preferentially making sure that girls who, frankly, we've seen young girls and the pregnancy rates go up significantly when schools close. Reopening schools and making them safe again for girls is particularly critical. And so it's about collecting data. It's about having the political will to do that. It's about linking major large-scale expenditures, as Kristalina Georgieva is doing at the IMF, to these types of metrics. And that was very much the spirit of the Beijing Plus 25 report that the Rockefeller hosted group of leaders, women leaders, put together. And I hope very much that the world takes those recommendations and acts on them.
Thank you, Raj, for reminding us of, how inequitable this dangerous and unjust times have been, particularly for vulnerable communities and especially women. And for reminding us too of where we are seeing the efforts put to reset in a more just and equitable way. But there is also, in times like this, a push to find equilibrium. And in such times, often the gains of the past decade in everything from gender equality to green energy, all can get deprioritized, or are some of the gains actually lost? How do you and the foundation work against this and continue the forward movement?
Well, Pat, the session you mentioned this past weekend highlighted an important report called the Goalkeepers Report that indicated that, in fact, in many cases, education, health, and immunization, maternal and child mortality, as we heard Hillary Clinton make reference to, we have lost in 25 weeks, in some cases, 25 years of progress on human development towards making the world more just and more equitable. And we have to reverse that trend. So the Rockefeller Foundation works to build public-private partnerships and makes big investments as big as we can to help create systemic change to reverse that trend. We've brought together, global philanthropists in an effort we call co-impact to invest in poverty reduction efforts that preferentially focus on women, and we're lifting up millions of women who otherwise would live in abject poverty in India and Africa and parts of Latin America, and doing that with a focus on measuring results and documenting progress. We've built large-scale partnerships between testing and contact tracing companies in America and around the world, biotechnology firms that make diagnostic tests for COVID-19, and crafted a national and a global strategy to dramatically accelerate testing as part of the COVID-19 response. We did that because we felt the response would be longer than most people realize. The vaccine is less of a silver bullet than most people realize. And the reality is for the next several years, for women to participate in the workforce and girls to go to school, you got to have much more frequent, cheap, effective testing being much more prevalent in our societies. So we try to focus on those systemic interventions that can really change the nature of equality and justice for hundreds of millions of people, and we do our best to bring people together, left and right, around the world, across political and business divides, to make a real difference.
And these initiatives are making a real difference, and thank you for all those efforts from the foundation. That report you referenced, Raj, the Goalkeepers Report from the Gates Foundation, the New York Times called it grim. And one of the reasons was that it said that in order to combat the loss that you described so eloquently, we are going to need the U.S. to step up. And that's a hard thing to call for at a time when we're focusing so much on the problems here. Again, do you see a role for the foundation, for philanthropists, and where is the role of government in all of this?
Well, absolutely. I think the Goalkeepers Report really helped give voice to something the World Bank has been issuing as projections over the last 4 months, which is that we are going to see, we've already seen about 425 million, perhaps more than 500 million people move back under the poverty line, an expanded version of the poverty line, because of COVID-19 and the economic fallout from this fundamentally public health oriented crisis. And the consequence of that, as we know, it's just devastating. I led the U.S. response to the Haiti earthquake. And when there's a crisis, women pay the price in horrific and violent and unjust ways. And I've seen that in Eastern Congo, I've seen that in Pakistan, I've seen that in New Delhi, I've seen it all over the world. So we have to avoid this outcome. And the only way to avoid the outcome is actually bringing people together. Philanthropy can make some investments and show the way forward. We can take some risks and innovate, as we did on creating a testing strategy for the United States and for many other parts of the world. We're doing that right now with green infrastructure plans that can help reach some of the poorest families in the world that have yet to be connected to electrification and therefore have yet to have the opportunity to be part of a modern economy. There are more than 1 billion people that live that way. We can take those risks, but those only succeed at scale if everybody works together. So I spend a lot of my time on fora like these asking leaders to work with us. We need the World Bank and the IMF and frankly, the G20 group of leaders to come together and make a bold statement this fall that in making trillions of dollars of recovery investments, we will focus on turning back the clock so we can pull those 500 million people back out of poverty. We will focus on women and girls so we can limit the deep injustice this crisis has already wrought on them all across the planet. And we'll focus on building back in a climate-friendly and equitable way so we can live in a world that's more fair and less angry. And that's just what we do. We've been doing it for more than 100 years. Sometimes we succeed, a lot of times we fail. And I take it that that's okay, but bringing people together across political and business divides to sort of solve these problems is really in the core of our approach.
And in times of crisis, Rogers, we all know there are these great risks of failure, but there's also great opportunity for leadership. And it's been noted, and probably will be noted many times during this Washington Post Live Forum, the role of women in this recovery, that there are certain differences, or there appear to be certain attributes brought to a crisis such as this that is proving that women leaders can make a very big difference. Do you see this? How do you assess the role of women leaders in times like this, but in all times?
Well, I think history is going to look at COVID-19 as a very clear example where the very best national responses to the pandemic crisis from a health and economic management perspective were almost uniformly led by women leaders. I think 8 heads of state that were women were amongst the top 10 performing nations in terms of aggregate performance at getting on top of COVID-19 and supporting an effective restart of their economy. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who I believe is on later today in this fora, it was a partner with me, and I was her partner really when she was the president of Liberia dealing with the Ebola crisis. And the one thing I learned from that is there's no substitute for strong, steady, empathetic, and science-based leadership at the head of state level during a national pandemic that threatens the economy, that threatens society, and that causes untold numbers of deaths. And it has just been the case in this scenario that women leaders have proven to be perhaps more cool-headed, more science and data-driven, and more determined, and less, more consistent in how they've approached COVID-19. And I suspect a lot of people will look at that example and take inspiration from it.
Certainly, we're hearing today from women who exemplify all of the characteristics of leadership that you just discussed. And I am greatly heartened and given a great deal of hope by your assessment that out of this time may come a different level of admiration for and support for additional women leaders across all sectors. I have to wonder, as I think about your work day to day, making decisions about where money goes, where priorities are set, and knowing that you're very clear about the objectives of a just and equitable recovery. What gives you hope?
Well, I always think it's in the darkest moments of crisis that we see both the innovations and the willingness to do things differently that create the next wave of human progress. I saw that in a more modest way in places like Haiti during the earthquake, where losing 300,000 people in a small country almost immediately was so heartbreaking and devastating. And yet out of that came 4 or 5 years of rapid growth and job creation and cutting malnutrition and improving health for women and girls in particular. And Haiti's still a tough place, of course, but it was real progress. And I think we've seen that in the Marshall Plan after World War II that reconstructed Western Europe, which at the time was experiencing widespread hunger and abject poverty. I mean, that's why we put together a Marshall Plan. And so, I look now and I say, I think we're going to see a wave of leadership come together and say we need a Marshall Plan that will help extend the best of our values, the best of our commercial and fiscal capabilities, and help turn back the clock so that we don't lose the 25 years of human development progress. And the fact that, everybody today, I was in the poorest community in 3 hours outside of a city in Bihar, India in November, and everyone's on their cell phone. Everybody is looking at images of a better life and a better world. And everyone now has the expectation and the aspiration that they too deserve to touch and to seek that type of life. And so I just don't think it's okay anymore to have 2 billion people live in poverty and suffering. It's not okay to stomach the extraordinary violence and inequity that women and girls face in that setting. And certainly at the Rockefeller Foundation, we are all in on bringing together countries, development banks, civil society partners, community groups, scientists, and businesses to build back better. And we think it's possible to turn back the clock and move a couple billion people up the economic ladder of opportunity if we do this right, and if we do it right now.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us all that hope, Raj, that we will, that the Rockefeller Foundation is all in, and that you and your personal commitment as a global development and philanthropist leader certainly exemplify for us that each and every one of us has a role to play in ensuring that there is a just and equitable recovery and reset as we move forward beyond these dangerous times. Thank you very much for this time together.
Thank you, Pat, for your leadership and for doing this.
Back to the Washington Post Live.
Women are working for change throughout the world. I will be with them and one of them forever.
I'm now honored to welcome the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She's a Nobel laureate. She's known as Africa's Iron Lady. Thank you for joining us from Monrovia, Liberia's capital, President Sirleaf.
Thank you.
Thank you for
It's a pleasure
joining.
to be here.
We're delighted to have you. So you
Thank
took
you.
over in 2006, the first woman to be elected head of an African state. And you just come out of a devastating civil war and unemployment was at 80%. What did being a woman contribute to the way you led the country out of that?
As a woman,
Yes.
coming into a country that had been devastated by war, with the damage not only to infrastructures, but damage to values, damage to relationships, damages to international relations, I had to bring into it not only the level of competence to be able to address our problems, but also to recognize that I couldn't do it alone. I had to build a team, mostly of young people, who could work with me with shared values, that we might be able to prepare our agenda and our long-term vision. And then we also had to have a compact with the people. People who had been a part of war, young men who had been child soldiers and had not had an education for 2 decades. We had to give them the confidence that whatever we do will enable their lives to start a process of being normal again. We had to reach a compact with our people, and particularly women in the rural areas, women who had left their homes out of fear because of war, and to ensure them that they could be safe when they return, because we would have in place the policies, the protection to our re-energized security services, who will be trained to respect those whom they serve, and are reaching out to all of our many citizens who had left the country, many residing in refugee camps in neighboring countries, as well as in many countries abroad, now in the diaspora that was no longer connected with us, to assure them that our conditions were going to be sufficiently in a condition for them to return home and become a part of the processes of rebuilding.
President Sirleaf, you speak so movingly about...
Done by a man.
I'm sorry. I think our audio went over. You speak so movingly about empowering women. You work so hard to do this as a president, including increasing the number of women police officers to something like 17% of the force. Which of these empowerment processes worked well? Where were the big challenges in bringing women into positions of authority or influence?
Our big challenges happen to be in the places that should have been easier, to bring a large number into our legislature, into parliament, as it's called elsewhere, to ensure that they would be there to pass the laws that will lead to the protection of women, to stop the violence against women, and to ensure that all the laws will show equal opportunity, equity, and justice for women. That proved more difficult than I thought, because the party structures in our country, the political party structures, and I believe in most other African countries and beyond, shut women out. And so all the party structures comprise men who dominate and they show. That is the men who stand for elected positions. And while there have been breakthroughs here and there, but there is a tendency to make sure women do not get the numbers to enable them as a bloc to be effective in instituting the changes that are necessary.
That's fascinating. I know you're under great time pressure today, and I have one last question I want to ask you. Both High Commissioner Bachelet and Secretary Clinton referred to this group of 25 women leaders who have been revisiting the issues from the famous Beijing Women's Conference. Can you tell us about your recommendations? How are you going to ensure that they will be implemented?
I really believe that we have to change our tactics in this. We must now convince men of the need for change, because it's the men who will have to make sure that they support women to change these laws. And until we can get them to sit together and to recognize the role of women, the important part that women play to ensure sound economic performance. Until we can get them to see that violence against women affects the country in so many ways, and it stops a young girl, a woman, from achieving their aims. That's the way we can try to break the stereotypes. We can change the cultural norms and the entrenched values when we can bring men who have wives, who have daughters, who also want to have them excel and advance to the levels of their dreams. They have to work support arrangements with women to be able to make the change that we all want to see. And so what do I think is we need to do most? We need to bring the men together. We need for them to have the capacity to listen, to include, to adapt, and to care.
President Sirleaf, we need to convince the men. It's a message we will take on with us. It was an honor to speak with you today. Thank you so much for joining Washington Post Live.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that's all we have time for today with President Sirleaf, with the UN High Commissioner Bachelet, and of course hearing from Secretary Clinton. But we have a great lineup coming for you later on today with Washington Post Live. My colleague Anne Hornaday will be joining you, and she will be speaking with actor Jeff Daniels, writer-director Billy Ray, and former FBI Director James Comey about the Showtime miniseries, The Comey Rule. As always, you can go to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find more details. I'm Frances Steed Sellers. Thank you so much for joining us today.